This week, E3 hit Los Angeles, meaning we've been overwhelmed by big reveals, major announcements, and actual details for so many games. Due to TV shows and timelines and deadlines, we aren't able to cover all of this week's news in this episode, so we're taking a little time to put everything together neatly, and we'll bring you all the highlights from the show floor next week.
Instead, this week, we've hunted through the history books and dug up some dirt about the Australian video games industry. Believe it or not, we've been making games locally for nearly 40 years now. It's hardly been smooth sailing the entire time, but some of the world's most iconic games were made right here in the land down under.
It is, of course, impossible to highlight all of the amazing studios that have risen and fallen across the country, but we'll start at the beginning. In the early 80s, Australian game development was synonymous with one company, Melbourne House. Formed as a book distributor in 1977, by 1980 the focus had shifted towards game development, creating games for the Sinclair ZX80 and 81.
Just 2 years later, and the studio, now known as Beam Software, had created one of the most iconic games of its generation, an illustrated text adventure interpretation of The Hobbit, playable on just about every home computer that was available at the time, including the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64 and the BBC Micro.
And sure, text adventures were popular at the time, but The Hobbit tried something different, an all-new engine written by Veronica Megler and Philip Mitchell, which understood advanced sentences rather than simplistic go north that gamers had been used to. Plus, it had pictures, which was pretty neat. The game was, predictably, a bestseller, winning awards and selling more than 100,000 copies in its first 2 years on sale, which at the time was huge.
It wasn't just text adventures though. Beam Software also created a number of other games, including 1985 Commodore 64 beat-em-up, Way of the Exploding Fist, which started life as a karate-inspired sports simulation title and quickly morphed into the sort of fighting game we know and love today. Combining joystick controls, animated characters, and innovative sound effects, Way of the Exploding Fist broke new ground in the fighting game genre and again took home multiple awards for Beam Software.
However, it didn't last. After selling off its publishing arm, Beam found itself doing less creative work, instead developing games commissioned by overseas companies. The studio focused on projects targeting the Australian market, including international cricket and Aussie rules footy, as well as shifting to racing games, including Death Cars, GP500, Test Drive Le Mans, and Looney Tunes Space Race.
Another Melbourne-based studio, Blue Tongue Entertainment, was founded in 1995 as a web development company that soon moved into video games. Early works included an AFL sports game, an equestrian simulator, and tie-in works for movies like Jurassic Park, The Polar Express, and Starship Troopers.
While all that was going on in Victoria, things were happening in Adelaide too. Ratbag Games started making games in 1993, and its debut title Power Slide was released in 1998, stereotyping the company as a racing simulator studio. Over the years, Ratbag released several PC racing titles before jumping to the PS2 to create World of Outlaws, Sprint Cars 2002. But it also developed many other titles that would remain unpublished.
Heading north, Brisbane's Fortitude Valley was seeing its own flurry of attention, with the creation of Krome Studios in 1999. While the studio primarily focused on surfing games and children's titles, including Barbie, Disney and Nickelodeon franchises, it also worked on its own original creation, Ty the Tasmanian Tiger.
Well, you must be Ty.
G'day. So, you old coot, what's this contraption do?
This contraption is the key to finding the talismans. Why is this so? It's quite simple, really. It uses an oscillatory microfeeder to scan for trace energy signals that match the unique power matrix of the talismans.
Huh?
Like a big nose that sniffs them out.
Oh.
Ah.
While the Melbourne scene saw another reshuffle in 1999 when Beam Software was bought by French company Infogrames and renamed Infogrames Melbourne House, the Brisbane scene was preparing for an explosion, and for once we mean in a good way. Independent US developer Pandemic opened an Australian studio in Brisbane in 2000 which worked on games like Army Men RTS and the Destroy All Humans series.
The UK strategy developer The Creative Assembly also opened a new studio in Brisbane in 2002, with the team put to work on the Total War series, before releasing ambitious post-apocalyptic real-time tactics game Stormrise.
Back to Adelaide though, and Ratbag released The Dukes of Hazzard: Return of the General Lee in 2004, which broke the simulation mould and took more of an adventure approach to racing, but it wasn't well received. By August 2005, Ratbag was acquired by Midway Games and renamed Midway Studios Australia, but 4 months later the developer was unceremoniously shut down by the publisher a week away from Christmas.
After the break, things get a little more rosy for the local industry, but it wasn't long before more Aussie developers found themselves out of work.
In 2004, Melbourne-based Blue Tongue was bought out by THQ, who also founded another developer, THQ Studio Australia, and both studios concentrated primarily on licensed titles. THQ Studio Australia released a number of games focusing on the animated Avatar series, while Blue Tongue created games for Nicktoons until 2008, when it released De Blob, to the delight of fans and critics alike.
Spotting the surprisingly large number of unemployed game developers in Adelaide following the demise of Ratbag Games, Brisbane-based Krome stepped in, creating Krome Studios Adelaide in early 2006 to work on games for home console and handheld platforms.
2006 also saw Infogrames, by then known as Atari, decide to close its internal studios, and Melbourne House was sold again to Krome, which was expanding rapidly. This combined developer, now with offices in Adelaide, Melbourne and Brisbane, went to work on tie-in games for Star Wars: The Clone Wars, Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen, and Legend of the Guardians: The Owls of Ga'Hoole, as well as the multiplayer sequel Viva Pinata Party Animals, and the 2006 reboot of The Legend of Spyro.
However, by 2010, things weren't quite so rosy for Krome. First, the Adelaide office was shut down completely, with significant job cuts at both the Brisbane and Melbourne offices. By October of that year, it was reported that all remaining Krome staff had been let go. Since then, we've seen a few flurries of activity, mainly focusing on rebooting Ty the Tasmanian Tiger, which surfaced on Xbox 360, iOS and Windows Phone in 2013. But as a whole, Krome as we knew it was gone.
It was a similar story at the Creative Assembly. Soon after releasing Stormrise to some fairly mixed reviews, the developer was renamed Sega Studios Australia and put to work on franchises other than the traditional strategy games it started with. Projects included the Nintendo DS version of Sonic Classic Collection and the official game of the London 2012 Olympic Games.
The Australian Pandemic Office survived the 2005 shake-up that saw the studio join forces with BioWare, but when the joint company was sold to EA soon after, it lasted just 12 more months, closing in 2009 while busily working on now-cancelled Batman title The Dark Knight. Some former employees moved to Pandemic Los Angeles, but by November, the entire Pandemic brand was shut down, again mid-game, meaning the world never got to see Mercenaries sequel, Mercenaries 3 No Limits, or the in-development spin-off Mercs Incorporated.
That wasn't the end of EA's involvement with Australian developers though. Dead Space developer Visceral Games had a little-known Melbourne studio who contributed to Dante's Inferno and Dead Space 2 before being closed in 2011.
Despite that, 2011 was actually a decent year for Aussie game development. Two of our most well-received local games were released, De Blob 2 from Blue Tongue and THQ, and the long-awaited LA Noir for Team Bondi and Rockstar Games.
Takes a certain animal cunning, lad. Do you think you might be ready for that?
What have we got? 2 stiffs, overdosed. The victim was dead before the car hit him.
Spill it, or we take you out in the alley and we knock it out of you.
You needed the money, so you killed her.
That's not true, goddammit! I thought you'd been under fire before. So I'm supposed to believe that you don't know what happened?
I expect you to draw your own conclusions.
Not gonna happen, fellas. This is your chance. Don't fail me.
Team Bondi was created in 2003 by Brendan McNamara, writer and director of The Getaway. The Sydney-based studio worked for nearly 10 years on McNamara's magnum opus, an old-school crime drama set in 1940s Los Angeles. LA Noire was finally released to great critical acclaim in May of 2011, but Team Bondi's celebrations were short-lived. Literally months after the game hit shelves, the studio found itself unable to secure funding for its next game project and was put into administration before being shut down for good. The last public project it was working on, Whore of the Orient, continues to attract controversy even 4 years later.
Things weren't much better for Blue Tongue and De Blog 2 either. Not long after the release of the award-winning game, a THQ restructure saw the publisher move away from licensed titles for games for kids, and both THQ Studio Australia and Blue Tongue were unceremoniously closed down, with THQ the publisher following suit just over a year later.
Sega did the same thing in 2013, announcing that while the Creative Assembly brand would remain based at its UK office, the Australian studio would be shut down later that year.
Obviously, there are any number of reasons that contribute to the closure of satellite studios for international developers. At its most basic though, the Aussie developers may have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. While the rest of the world suffered through the global financial crisis, Australia actually coped quite well, prompting a very strong Aussie dollar in the years that followed. Predictably, this meant that the Australian studios were no longer the cheap offshore alternative that they'd once been, and international publishers decided to shut up shop.
It's not all bad news though. The most recent few years have actually been quite good overall for the local industry, even though there were plenty of rough patches along the way. Up after the break, Australian success stories, which can pop up where you least expect them.
Even after the closure of so many studios, there's still one major games publisher with a presence in Australia, even if it is in the mobile arena. After many years, EA Australia has remained solid, largely thanks to careful acquisition of local indie developers.
Firemint was founded in Melbourne in 1999, focused on creating titles for the Game Boy Advanced and mobile devices well before smartphone gaming became the hit it is today. By 2009, the iPhone had hit the market and Firemint had hit its stride with breakout games of Flight Control and Real Racing.
At the same time, Iron Monkey Studios was also creating games for mobile devices, acquired by Electronic Arts in 2010. Firemint was acquired by EA the year after, and shortly after that, the two studios joined forces to become Fire Monkeys. This new Australian mega studio has worked on mobile tie-ins for big-name franchises including Need for Speed, Mirror's Edge, Mass Effect, Dead Space, and The Sims 3, and has continued working on its own IP, releasing Real Racing 3 in 2013. To date, Fire Monkeys are considered one of the leading games developers for iOS, and yes, they are still based in Melbourne.
However, the recent closure of Canberra-based 2K Australia officially marks the end of an era for Australian game development, as there are currently no AAA studios in the country.
Hit me with that!
2K Australia was created in 2002 to develop new intellectual property and co-develop products with other 2K studios, and over the next decade contributed heavily to Freedom Force, Tribes Vengeance, SWAT 4, The Bureau XCOM Declassified, and all 3 games in the Bioshock series, as well as taking the lead on Borderlands, the pre-sequel. However, it seems that all good things must come to an end, and the studio officially closed its doors on April 16.
But don't think this all means that there are no opportunities for game developers left in Australia. There are thousands of studios popping up across the country where programmers, artists and musicians are working on labours of love, pushing them onto smartphones, Steam Greenlight or other platforms, including more than a couple getting involved with ID at Xbox.
Realistically, this is a reflection of how the Australian game development industry has changed over the past 30 years. Almost a full circle. The earliest developers were working out of bedrooms and garages just as much as anywhere else around the world, and now it seems we've returned to our roots. Far from being disappointed at the loss of big-name studios, it's an exciting time as we're surrounded by fresh ideas, new projects and boundless creativity. Who knows what the next big thing will be?
There are other success stories too. Micro Forte was founded in 1985 and deliberately set out to create world-class AAA computer games, with studios in both Sydney and Canberra. The developer created games for the Commodore 64 and 128, as well as the IBM PC, and while the name might not be familiar, was one of the early pioneers in the world of massively multiplayer online role-playing games.
Micro Forte grew and evolved over 20 years, adapting and changing and reflecting growing needs of the industry. One of these major changes included the evolution of the Big World technology suite, which looks very different now than when it was first dreamed up back in 1996. Back then it was conceived as a relatively simple online network to facilitate multiplayer games. By 2002, Big World has been spun off into its own company, creating middleware development tools for other people to use for their MMOs and virtual worlds. And 10 years after it was founded, Big World middleware was officially sold to World of Tanks developer Wargaming for $45 million. The developer is still based in Sydney, employs around 70 people and continues to be an industry leader in its field.
Similarly, Bohemia Interactive has a studio quietly working away in New South Wales. While the developers aren't involved directly with the creation of games like Operation Flashpoint, Armour or DayZ, the local studio is responsible for a military training simulation program, VBS. This technology is used by a serious chunk of the Western military, including the United States Marine Corps, to train recruits in small unit military tactics. VBS is now up to its third build and is being used by the Defence Forces of Canada, Israel, New Zealand, the UK, the US and, of course, Australia. Who said games couldn't be used for good?
After all that, if you're feeling all inspired to check out some Australian developed games now that you've been reintroduced to the great work that our country has to offer, we've come up with a list of local games you really should play. Up next.
If you're feeling all inspired to check out some Australian developed games after our quick look at the history of local game development, we've come up with a list of Australian games you really should play.
Let's start with the big daddy of them all, BioShock. If you don't know what this game is, then you're missing out. BioShock is an amazing narrative-driven first-person shooter where you play as a man who stumbles across the underwater city of Rapture. Designed as a glorious utopia, it didn't take long for Rapture to fall into disrepair and be overrun by mutants. After uncovering the city, you must fight through the corridors to uncover the truth of what really happened. The city of Rapture is amazingly hostile. You'll turn a corner expecting to gun down a crazed bad guy only to be greeted by an empty crib with an audio log full of sadness. Play this one with the lights down and the sound up. BioShock is not only one of the best games to come out of Australia, but out of the industry as a whole.
I will happily admit that I do a lot of my gaming on smartphones and handheld devices, and I'm equally happy to admit that some of the best games for those platforms come from Australian developers. Flight Control was one of the first iOS games I can remember being seriously hooked on. The mechanics were, as all good games should be, simple to learn at first, but the longer you played, the more the difficulty ramped and ramped. Started as a holiday project by Firemint CEO Robert Murray, Flight Control used the iOS touchscreen as a design feature rather than an afterthought. But even though we thought this game would never work without it, versions of Flight Control have also popped up on DSiWare, WiiWare, PlayStation Network and Steam, as well as virtually all smartphones on the market.
Ever wanted to be a cop? Ever felt like you were born in the wrong era? Then you really should spend some time with Team Bondi's masterpiece, LA Noire. You're an old school detective navigating a city that's more full of shades of grey rather than simply black or white.
A shooting at the 111 Club. Half a dozen shooters, sir. Real professionals.
I'm only going to warn you once, gentlemen. Stay out of this.
I'm a middleman. I distribute for the LAPD.
Don't go into this one expecting a 1940s remake of Grand Theft Auto because that is far from the truth. LA Noire mostly revolves around searching for clues, questioning suspects, and, rightly or wrongly, accusing people of murder. Beautifully detailed, well written, and surprisingly tense, LA Noire is well worth booting up the PS3 again.
The Match 3 format behind Puzzle Quest Challenge of the Warlords is pretty standard fare. Switch discs of different colours to make lines and earn points. It's what it did with those points that set it apart. The game neatly blended traditional puzzle elements with role-playing and strategy, meaning that each matched line actually had a purpose as your character explores a map, accepts quests, meets interesting people, and enters combat. There were spells and special tiles and quite a detailed little story, but whether or not anyone was really playing for that is a different story. Matching tiles is really pretty addictive, and it's no surprise that Puzzle Quest went on to spawn a number of equally awesome sequels.
This might surprise you, but D-Blob is a game about a blob. A blob that bounces around splatting paint everywhere because some evil Nazi-like space alien has rocked up and outlawed colour. It is up to you to bring the rainbow back. Even if you can't figure out whether it's a puzzle game or a platformer, or maybe a bit of both, there's no denying that D-Blob is both fun and colourful, and it's for the Wii, which automatically sets it apart. Spawned from an independent project from a bunch of Dutch uni students, if you're fond of games like Jet Grind or Cooler World, or want to see what Nintendo did with colours well before Splatoon hit the stage, this one, or the creatively named D-Blob 2, should be top of your list.
And finally, the oldest game on our list, The Hobbit. It's an illustrated text adventure that came out of Melbourne House, and it's one of my long time favourites. I played it a lot as a kid. I think it was actually my first introduction to the works of Tolkien, and it was the start of a love of interactive fiction that's still with me today. The innovative language parser means that we could write in proper sentences, like ask Gandalf about the map, and the graphics, which were loaded as an outline that was slowly flood-filled with colour, meant that many of Tolkien's locations were actually on a screen right in front of you. At the time, it was mind-blowing. First released in 1982, it might be a bit difficult to find a copy these days, but in the world of software emulation, if you really want to play, you'll find a way.